Hyper Wrigley Field build part 9, and I start this one off. I'm already in the middle, or almost completed, building the luxury suites that sit underneath the upper deck. Later in this video, I will show you one of the most important parts of this entire project. I drew the red Marquee sign that sits on the corner of Addison and Clark. Or is it Clark and Addison? I don't know. Let's talk about these suites for a second before I'm done building them in this video. The suites were not added to Wrigley Field until 1989, so the year I was actually born. They're only 30 years old. They were built where the press box was, and then the press box was moved to where it currently is in the upper deck. Now, for the rest of this video, I'm going to talk about the history of the Marquee outside of the stadium, because I'm going to be showing you how I drew that at the end of this video, and I think it's going to be one of the highlights of this entire project. The Marquee was first installed in 1934 and was actually green with gold trim and white lettering at that time. There's no colored photos of that original green Marquee in 1934, but the Cubs gave us a glimpse of that when they painted the Marquee green again for a few days during the 2014 centennial celebration of the ballpark. When they did this, they didn't just go to Home Depot and pick out a random green. They did their due diligence. They worked with Benjamin Moore to match its colors from that 1930 original color scheme. They researched the Marquee's color schemes from that era, which included removing layers of paint and primer to expose the first layer of enamel. Samples were then color matched by Benjamin Moore to determine the mallard green and French Quarter gold paints that they used. One more note about the Marquee being green. When the Cubs took the Marquee down to renovate it before the 2016 season, they not only put a fresh coat of red on the front like we're used to, but they painted the backside of it green as well. So when you're inside the stadium, you can see the Marquee how it looked when it was installed in 1934. When that original green sign was installed in 1934, it was only green for a year or two, after which the Cubs painted it blue. The Marquee had this blue color scheme for about 30 years until it was finally painted the iconic red in 1964. Once they painted the Marquee red in '64, it has been red ever since then, with two exceptions. The most recent exception is that 2014 weekend where they painted it green to celebrate 100 years of Wrigley Field. But 4 years before that, they painted the Marquee purple. Yes, purple. That's because Wrigley Field hosted a college football game between the Northwestern Wildcats and the Illinois Fighting Illini. With Northwestern being the home team, that's why they painted it purple. This isn't the only time the Marquee was changed because of football. When the Bears played at Wrigley Field, occasionally they would change it from saying home of the Chicago Cubs to home of the Chicago Bears. Now that game where the Marquee got painted purple leads to a whole nother story that adds to some of the charm, uniqueness, and sometimes quirkiness of Wrigley Field. Wrigley Field has a history of doubling as a football stadium. It was the Bears' home from 1923 until 1970, and it was also home of the old Chicago Cardinals for a few years. The thing is, once the Bears moved to Soldier Field, Wrigley Field wasn't used as a football stadium again until that Northwestern game in 2010. In those 40 years, Wrigley Field had seen a lot of changes, whether it was the dugouts being expanded or extending the club seats. The amount of actual grass and dirt of Wrigley Field had shrunk since the Bears played there in 1970. You would have thought when Northwestern planned on playing this game, they would have taken this into consideration. Or at least they would have taken a tape measure out and measured the field to make sure a field would actually fit inside of Wrigley Field these days. But once they actually got out the paint and marked out the field, and it was literally the day before the game, they realized there just wasn't enough space behind one of the end zones. Even though the end line of the football field did fit onto Wrigley Field, there was literally just a foot or two between the end line and the iconic brick walls. Coaches from both teams feared that a player might slam into that wall when they're going after a pass on the back of the end zone. So a solution had to be made in the hours leading up to kickoff. The solution? Both teams would go in the same direction. That's right, both teams would try and score in the west end zone. So every time the possession switched and another team gained offensive possession, they would flip the field the same way they do in between quarters. The only way it was possible for anybody to score a touchdown in the east end zone would be a defensive touchdown or a punt return, which did not happen during the game. Despite the one-way snafu, in the box office, the game was a huge success. Northwestern drew more fans than they would for a typical home game. Usually to sell 40,000 tickets at Ryan Field, they need to invite a lot of the other team's fans. Now you've reached what I think is my favorite video that I've made so far in this project. I'm going to draw the Wrigley Field marquee. Scaled down so it's 2 centimeters wide and 1.3 centimeters high. While you're watching this, I want to get back to talking about Northwestern playing at Wrigley Field because they're scheduled to do it again in 2020 against Wisconsin. They're also going to do it again in 2022, 24, and 26, but they haven't announced their opponents yet. This time around, they shouldn't have the same one-way problem that they had against Illinois. You see, during the renovations they've done the last couple years, they've taken a few of the seats on the third base side as well as a little bit of the home dugout, and they've made them movable to make more room for a football field. I hope you all have enjoyed this video. Make sure to like, comment, and subscribe, and I'll catch you on the flippity flip.